who has joined us to open in prayer. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this opportunity to gather together. We're thankful for this weather that you send us, and you do send us what we need, not necessarily what we want. We ask that you would be with the Jorgensen family as they go through this surgery, that it might be well and heal, and that they can be back amongst us directly. And we ask that as we look into the history, we can see what happened into the past, what was good, what was bad, and guard us against making those same errors and mistakes as we move through in our growth and maturity to become more like your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Well, my topic today is the West in crisis. And we're not talking about California, Washington, and Oregon. We're talking about the Western Roman Empire. But anyway, before I start, there's been some people that ask about what some resources that they might look at for future study, and I just thought I'd show you a couple of them there. This is the main book that we're studying from to make these presentations here each Sunday. And also there's a supplemental book. One of them is by Tim Dowley and the other is by Bruce Shelley. They're both pretty good books, easy reading, not too technical, that bring you through the history of Christianity or the church history. And actually, that's just two different ways to say, and I think the same thing based on what it says. So when we get into church history, how come we're uncovering so much about the Roman Empire, secular history? Why? I thought we were in church history, not Roman history. But I've come to discover that there's a saying, I'll modify it a little bit, that whatever happens in Rome does not stay in Rome. See, the events of the Roman Empire, what happened to them, what was going on with them, did have a direct bearing on both the Eastern and the Western churches. And as the empire divided into its Eastern and Western part, also Christianity divided into its Eastern and Western part. And both of them having their own unique ideas and philosophies and thinking of the way the things that get run to be done. So the church divided into what we call, or historians call, the Western Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, in this sense, Catholic doesn't mean what you think it does. It means a universal, the Western Universal Church. And today we're going to be covering, as the topic says, the West in crisis. We're going to talk about the things that happened in the Western Empire that impacted the Western Catholic Church. And the reason I bring this up, we don't want to confuse this term with Roman Catholic Church, which is a different thing entirely, and it's going to be coming up later on into our study. And this week, I say we're just talking about the West, and next week the topic is the Eastern Orthodox Church. Just a quick outline of what we're going to be looking at, or what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be go back into history just a little bit to recap that division of the Roman Empire, talk about Gregory the Great. He was the Bishop of Rome. What impact did he have? What things did he bring? And then the Western Church expansion. What was the effect and where did it go to? And then what I call the changing of the guard. After the Roman Empire in the West went down, some foreign empires came in and took their place as far as the secular rulers went, but still problems persisted. I know you can't read this, but the important thing is in the color, and you don't need to read color. That purple line across there indicates the Roman Empire. And you can see that I think the difficulty started between the East and the West when Diocletian split the empire up way back in 305. at the start of the 4th century. He split the empire into 4 different parts. And also, these are the 4 different parts that he moved to, and he set up an emperor under each one of those parts. And another thing that he did was move the capital from Rome up to Milan, Italy. The reason he did that was so he would be closer to the border to be able to control that evasions and pressures that was coming down from those barbarian troops up to the north of him. And then Constantine, of course, brought that empire back together after he whooped up on them other 3 guys and took the empire back. But then he moved the capital over to Constantinople. So you can see Rome might have had their nose out of joint just a little bit, because they were the city, the capital of the Roman Empire. And then here come along these 2 guys and moved it clear off almost out of their map. So I think this kind of set up a little bit of friction and a little bit of bad feelings between the East and the West as far as the empires went, and it followed also as far as the churches went. Well, after Constantine brought it back together, as you see in that red square, he passed on and split the empire again amongst his 3 sons. And those 3 sons started doing battle with each other, as siblings sometimes do, to see who's the best. And civil war followed, and Constantius won the war with his battles and become the sole empire, and he brought it back together for that brief period of time and passed it on to these 3 guys that circle now: Julian the Apostate and Jovian. Well, after Jovian died, the empire then split into the 2 different parts, the East and the West, and never to come back together again as a united empire. And there's a map of what they divided up, how the spoils were divided. I thought it was interesting to look at this, the empire, and I thought of the Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Yep, the 2 legs of iron become a reality. So the Western Empire, we're going to be talking about it next week. We're going to get into what the Eastern Empire's difficulties and or troubles were. But it was weakened by invasions, incursions, barbarians coming in. The threat of the invasion caused this withdrawal of troops, of the Roman troops, from this area of Gaul and Britain. And these invasions were, the word I put down here is exacerbated, increased, enlarged, and greatened, because about 540, the bubonic plague hit Europe. So you had invasions, you had the sicknesses, you had the civil wars, you had all this stuff decimating the population, and Rome was, quite frankly, running out of people to be in charge of stuff. They were running out of leaders with the corruption, plague, wars, infighting. The empire was weakened down, and these German tribes, or these northern tribes, warring tribes, saw an opportunity. Well, we can move right on in to this weakened empire. This slide shows the invasions, and it does kind of look like spaghetti, but it does cover about a 400-year period. And the first thing that happened about 402 is a Visigoth military commander, and that is the purple, yes, dark purple line. He invaded into northern Italy. And it's interesting that as a soldier, before he decided to invade Italy, he had fought alongside of the Roman troops in Italy. And then the Huns, they got excited and started moving in. That's your green line. They crossed the Rhine and invaded the Gaul area and migrated down to Spain. And these 2 things were what caused the Romans to withdraw their forces from Britain in 410 and opening up the doors for the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Franks, the yellow arrows, to move from their areas on into the British Island and northern parts of Europe. And all of this withdrawing of the troops and bringing them back home to guard the home front wasn't any avail, because Alaric did sack Rome in that year of 400. And meanwhile, just a few years later, the king of the Vandals, the Blue Line, brought his people down and circled around and created havoc all through the land, winding up taking over the Roman territories in North Africa and establishing Carthage as their capital, from whence they were able to continually make raiding harassments onto the Roman peninsula proper. And while those Huns didn't really they got turned back and defeated, but as they moved in, the Green Line again, as they moved in, it forced a group to move into the Roman territory, a German group that became later on one of the ruling groups of the German territory. The Ostrogoths, that would be the light purple line. They moved in and took care of it. So this is, I hope it wasn't too confusing, but there was a lot that happened into there in this period of time, with Roman being weakened. And I think part of this Roman weakening, remember, over there in Constantinople, that's where the headquarters was, and they might not have been too concerned with these invasions going on off into the western part, and they really weren't able to provide the protection that that western part needed. So after about 200 years, 300 years of chaos, this is what the Roman Empire looked like. Now, the labels probably aren't as important as the colors. You can see that once solid Western Roman Empire now become a hodgepodge of barbarian kingships, lordships, rulerships. Well, this brings us then to Gregory the Great. He was the Bishop of Rome at the end of the 4th century. And there were some problems that, as we look at the impacts that happened onto Rome, the impacts that Gregory as the Bishop of Rome was facing, you can see, remember there was a growing difference all the time between the Eastern and the Western churches, the Eastern and the Western empires. And this intensity kept increasing, and as we're going to see, eventually wound up in a permanent split between both of those entities. And at the same time that this was happening, these German and barbarian invasions moved in. They weren't totally barbarian. Some of them were definitely pagans, but you also had, from the eastern part of Germany, Arian Christians moving in to Rome. Now, if you remember, we talked about schisms and difficulties. The Arians, they were the ones that had these different ideas that Jesus really wasn't the Son of God. He was a created being. And so these people were moving into the church, if you will. And also the Celtic. I keep wanting to say Celtic, and Sharon says, no, it's Celtic. And I said, oh, so we're going to go watch the Boston Celtics play? And also some just pure paganisms moved into the empire. And there was impacts that went on in the empire, both the empire and the Western church, because of these groups. So I want to look just a little bit about what was the state of the empire when Gregory became Bishop of Rome in 590. He was at the crossroads of the development of the Christian church. In fact, I'm thinking nobody would really say it straight out, but as you read through, bishop got changed into pope, and the church, or the Roman diocese, got changed into the papacy as you read some of the literature into it. So somewhere into here, that transformation took place. But he was at the crossroads of the development. And of course, he was in conflict with the bishop over in Constantinople, because the bishop in Constantinople started referring himself, I'm the ecumenical patriarch. And to put that into English, I'm the church father. Well, Gregory didn't like that at all. He didn't think this guy ought to be claiming that, and he took the humble route. I'm the servant of the servants of the church. But anyway, this ongoing disagreements between the East and the West had been in existence, as I said, since at least the 4th century. In the 300s, this thing started, and it's a family feud that just kept going and kept going. And any semblance of unity between the Eastern Church and the West Church was just merely a pretense, because everybody, because everything was loose, everybody wanted to be top dog. I think if you could put it into our time frame, it would be like a primary election where there's about 4 candidates. And as I said before, civil wars, invasions, the plague, they weakened and harassed those empires in the West and made it difficult for them to get their jobs. So they saw that those bishops and those priests kind of had their little areas under control, so they started looking to them to assistance in secular matters. Hey, you guys, you're already set up with your organization, your standard. Can you take care of this little solid waste disposal, if you will, this problem for us? And also the increased population and the increased penetration of the German peoples, this created a need for some new leaders, and the Christian bishops were increasingly fulfilling this role. In fact, I think they enjoyed increasingly fulfilling this role. All through this whole study, I kept thinking about, this isn't nothing new. Sadducees, Pharisees, this isn't nothing new. And wait a minute, somebody said that, nothing new under the sun. Anyway, I talked about this primary election between the 4 of them. There was all the cities had their bishops, but there was 4 of them that were kind of considered the great imperial cities with their great bishops, and that was the city of Antioch, Alexandria, Egypt, Rome, and Constantinople. With Rome and Constantinople, because that's where the capital used to be and where the capital now is, they kind of rose to the top. And since the capital was in Constantinople, from Constantinople's eyes, they were the top of the top. But I don't know the Bishop of Rome really felt that way at all, because you read through the comments by the historians, that's not there. But anyway, that's some of the situation that Gregory kind of inherited. And he wasn't really interested in being pope anyway. He kind of enjoyed his time in the monastery of being a monk. In fact, I think it said he was the first monk to become pope. See, I'm already starting to translate or integrate that terminology. But anyway, what was the impact of those invaders on Gregory the Great? Well, he made efforts. He really wanted to develop ties between himself, the church, and these Christian, Aryan, Germanic kingdoms. Let's bring them together. And those German kings, as they moved their tribes into Roman territory to escape the Huns, to escape other oppressions, they wanted to integrate their people with the Catholic populations. But the differences of way the worldview and the church view was just too far apart for that to happen. Plus, the Catholic population looked at these new leaders and rulers that was coming in from foreign countries. What are you heretics doing trying to tell us what to do? And as I said before, these bishops had kind of enjoyed the power that they had when the old Roman authority kind of waned and weakened, and they were allowed to pick up the slack. But then here come this new group of people that wanted to pick up the slack that they had picked up the slack. Does it make any sense, the fight that was going on? Well, one possible solution that come up with, how do we handle all these invading groups? How do we take care of this? How do we get together? How do we all just get along? Well, one possible solution was, let's just convert these invaders over. Let's bring them into the club, make them part of the church. And the invaders, they kind of look to the Roman church as, that's the church to belong to. We can make contacts, we can make friends, we can be in there. We want to belong, but we don't want to conform to all those rules and regulations and doctrines they've got, but we want to become members. Nothing new under the sun. Reminds me of some churches that we was members of back when. Because these German invaders, as I said, did include the Arian Christians and just pure pagans. I want to talk a little bit about the concept of individual conversion versus mass conversion. Because see, when these guys come in, the king converted and his whole tribe followed. But individual conversions, we're talking about the concept of your conversion follows a period of instruction prior to baptism so you understand what you are joining. And some of the issues with that you may not have thought about is after you join, you're still living amongst the pagans that you were living amongst before. And you are going to be uprooted from your culture because you have new thoughts, new goals, new priorities than you had before. And you are going to be living as aliens in this pagan culture. And you're probably going to be shunned by your friends and relatives that don't go along with you. That's some of the things that happen on an individual basis of being converted over. Whereas mass conversion, it's a follow the leader kind of a concept. You're not uprooted from your culture. You're not living in an alien culture. You're not leaving friends and relatives because they're coming right along with you. And you can bring in your superstitions and behavior that you had before because, well, everybody else is doing it. We're all in this together. So just a little aside there are some of the differences between mass conversions and individuals. But we're going to talk now specifically about Gregory's rise to power. As I said, invasions, floods, wars, and the plague. And the Church of Rome was the only really organization that survived these attacks. And the prestige of the Bishop of Rome kind of rose a little bit because of his administration was the reason his organization survived these attacks. Plus, the church at that time had fairly extensive holdings of land where they raised the food, they owned the food. Where these disasters hit, they became kind of a feeding station. So Gregory now was no longer just thought of as just a church leader, but he started to become this important political figure. But he still humbly maintained, I'm just the servant of the servants of God, publicly. When you read what he did and how he tried to extend the church influence, as we're going to cover over a little bit, you can see that, well, while he maintained this humility, he took every opportunity that he had when the opportunity and the ability arose to expand his influence. And I think it's into this time that he started seeing himself not as the servant of the servants of God, but maybe as the bishop of bishops, not too far away from the P-O-P-E word, Pope. But that's Don's speculation. Also during this period of time, though, it happened as Gregory saw some chances for loosening ties with over in the East, because some religious developments happened. One of them was called the iconoclast controversy. That's where they started having an argument over, should we have pictures of Jesus? Should we have statues of them? Should we have pictures of the saints in the church, or should we not? I mean, no graven image, no idol. This started to become a point of controversy. Also, well, wait a minute. What about Mary? Was she a perpetual virgin, or did she have other kids? See, these arguments started up about this time. And one side accepted those things, and the other side rejected those things. And also, the principle of the emperors being involved in church business became even more of a big issue, because remember, the East kind of accepted that. It's okay for that emperor to be muddling himself into church because he is the president. And on the West, they said, nope, that's none of his business. What has the emperor to do with the church was the big byline that come up. And also, because the East wasn't able to keep those barbarians and the tribes from infiltrating and attacking onto them, they looked at, we need a new protector. We need somebody that's going to really be devoted to keeping those tribes away from us. And the West started looking to those Germanic kings, because those German tribes were kind of a warring bunch of fighting guys anyway. You know, drink beer and have a fight. That's Saturday night. In fact, one of the German emperors that came in, the name of Pepin, he did recover some territories in the northeast part of the West and also central Italy from the Lombards that had taken it over, and gave that to the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope of Rome, kind of intermingled term at this time, and it's called the donation of Pepin. He strengthened their prestige and increased their power and authority and their holdings. Well, as long as we're talking about Gregory a little bit, I ran across, especially into that book by Shelley, some of the things of Gregory's theology that he brought to the Western Empire that I thought was interesting. See, and Shelley, in his book, he said Gregory didn't have any real new ideas. He kind of brought over some stuff that he had learned from his predecessors. Well, I can identify with that. His teachers were Ambrose. Do you remember him? Way back when, he was the Bishop of Milan that come up with this. Maybe he didn't come up with it, but he fell onto it, this scheme. I can control the emperors by threat of excommunication, kind of starting that process running. Another one of his heroes was Augustine. Way back when, Augustine, and he started saying, well, you can really do a lot of allegory in understanding the scripture. And Jerome was his third one. And Jerome was big on monastery living, and also, remember, he wrote the Latin Vulgate, which became the prime text for the Roman Catholic Church for quite some number of years. But he was responsible for formulating the common faith of the day, passing it on to the Church of the Middle Ages. So I'm going to look a little bit about what some of his theology was. A doctrine of man. Adam's fall did, in fact, affect all of his descendants. It weakened them, but it didn't destroy their free will. And once a person is moved by grace to accept Christ, he could cooperate with that grace and win further merit by his good works. And so merit then become a joint product of divine grace and human will, which brought him to his doctrine concerning baptism. It grants forgiving grace, did I say that right the first time? Without any merit on man's part. But sins committed after baptism must be atoned for by some sort of penance, punishment inflicted. Which kind of earlier read about all of these guys that waited till almost they were dying and dead before they got baptized. Oh, here's why. Once you get washed clean, you want to stay clean and not take any chances of getting dirty before you die, because if you do die, you've got this penance that needs to be done. And penance requires meritorious works. And it'll have to involve sacrifice. It'll have to involve suffering. And knowing some stuff that happened into the future, this sacrifice kind of implied financial sacrifice. Suffering implied, well, let's come and do some works for. Oh, forgot one on penance. The greater your sin after baptism, the more penance that would need to be done to make up for those sins. Now, have you done enough? Well, when you meet the Lord, you will find out. Because you will either meet Him or you will go to a purgatory, which is number 2 down the road. And in this whole concept come up this doctrine of saints and martyrs. See, fortunately for the sinners, especially those that sinned after baptism, you've got some saints. And you can petition to them for help because they're a little closer to God and they can get their message to Him a lot quicker. I'm making some of this stuff up and being facetious about it, but I think that was kind of the concept behind it. And you can appeal to the saints for intercession with whatever your problem is, because and this appealing became central to your Christian life. Whenever you run into a problem, find the proper saint to go to with that problem, say the proper prayer to solve that problem. Problem solved. And along with saints and martyrs, Gregory encouraged, these guys are special. These guys are important. Let's gather up all the relics, remnants of stuff we can find of these guys. Locks of hair. Shelley even said fingernails. Pieces of clothes. Anything, bones. Anything left over, and we can bring them back in here for our sacred place where we can venerate these saints, these martyrs, because they are special people. I ran across, it's a little later on there, a list of 20 of the most important saints. What was their area of specialty? And most of them had 3. One of them had 4. And what is your problem that you should have? What problems are you having that you should go to this saint in prayer with to get that problem resolved? And there was at least 3 of those for each one of those. This wasn't an ancient document that I ran across. It was a current document on a church website. Where did I leave off? Purgatory. So if these saints and relics aren't enough, your sins can be atoned after death in this place called purgatory. And this is a place of purification and suffering for those that had not yet attained perfect righteousness. Now, I never could find a definition of what's the difference between almost righteous and perfect. How bad of a sin did you have to have before you went straight to hell? Or it wasn't really a bad sin, and you could go into this purgatory and work it off with your, of course, suffering in purgatory. And the last one is this doctrine of the Eucharist. If that's a new word for you, we call it communion. The concept he was pushing was that Christ's body and blood are really present in the bread and the wine. You've possibly heard this before. It's really there. It's a process called transubstantiation, where when you do the right stuff, it turns it into the right stuff. And this communion is offered by the priest for the sins of the person, but it's only effective for the person that's participating in the Eucharist. And the good news is, if you happen to be one that slipped up just a little bit, or maybe even a bigger little bit and went into purgatory, This Eucharist can be offered for you in purgatory, being of a great benefit in shortening the amount of time that you have to be there to become perfectly righteous. Interesting doctrines, I thought. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what happened to this church expansion I kind of alluded to earlier. And the first one was the gospel among the Franks. Who was the Franks? Well, there's the ballpark Franks, there's the kosher Franks, there's the Jew. No. These are names of three basic tribes up in Germany, area of now Germany, that were, and later they became called Germanic kings, but the Franks. But Christianity from the Franks was brought in two different ways, directly from paganism or indirectly through this Aryan tribes that come up to there. See, this Arianism, these tribes more associated the church with the gatherings rather than any theological concerns, because these Aryan Germans, remember I said, let's go have a good fight on Saturday night. That's fun. But they also like sitting around and listening to tales of lore about the heroes of the past that come in and conquered and won. And they weren't really interested in the niceties of what we would call abstract theology, because the Aryan concept, the Christ, he was the firstborn of the creature. And they kind of considered him, hey, he's just a glorified warlord. Actually, some comments said that Peter was their big hero because he was the only one on the arrest of Christ that pulled out a sword and was ready to go do battle with him. So that's the kind of person that caught their attention and their admiration. And also, these Arian churches didn't have a so structured hierarchy or a central authority like the Roman church had, so you can see some real conflict coming already. Different structure, different beliefs, different heroes. And also their churches, but while they didn't have a structure, they belonged to the clans. This town had its church. This town had its church. This town had its church. And kind of like an independent denomination, not denomination, congregation. Oh, so we're the church here. Okay. And they didn't accept the Roman rule, centralized rule. And actually, back onto this saints thing, it seems like they might have had more importance or more meaning to the Frank Christian than Christ himself did, because who did you go to in time of need? You went to the saints. And the increased veneration of these saints also resulted in increased veneration and collection of their relics, their parts, so that you could have something of your church saint sitting in your church. I kind of think that when you look at this, the saints and that and all that stuff, are we really just swapping a pagan god for a religious saint? I mean, pagans had a god that could do the god of the harvest, the god of the flood, the god of the rain, and here we got a saint of the toothache, a saint of the headache, a saint of the... Yeah. And that's just me again. What's the difference? I don't think there is any. But... not meaning to step on any toes, just telling you what I think. So, that was what happened in the Franks when they started coming into the country. But we weren't happy with that, because that relationship that Gregory had with the Franks, while it wasn't the ideal relation, it did open up the doors for him to move into missions into England. And his goal was to convert the barbarians, bring them into the Christian community that's going to be led by me or the Pope. So he appointed Augustine. Now this is a different Augustine from the one way back when. A different Augustine and 40 monks to go into England and to extend the influence of the Roman Christian church not Roman Catholic, Roman Christian Church into England. And these efforts didn't move really too fast because of the political, the religious, the competition, the kings. And Augustine, he come in there kind of hard line. You need to adopt our traditions. You need to adopt our mode of worship. Kind of reminds me of some stories you read of our early missionary efforts where you need to become civilized before you can become Christianized. Well, they got done up in England and started moving on up into the Celtic country, and they ran into some problems because they were Christians, Celtic Christians, and their practices were drastically different from Rome. They had a different way of dating when is Easter, and I didn't ever see what their mode of dating was, but maybe it didn't bounce all around the calendar like ours do, because, Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the first day of spring. And their traditions of baptism was different. And also, when Augustine and his buddies moved on north, they had an effort to convert the Anglo-Saxons. And you remember earlier on the map, this is part of the group that moved in and on the yellow lines into the island. So they weren't really on speaking terms good with him. Kind of like Jonah told to go to Nineveh. They weren't too excited about getting them converted. Plus, they already had over 100 years of Christian history. Remember St. Patrick? He was there in 432. So they already had an established religion going, and then here come these guys up from the Western Roman Empire you got it all wrong. Here's what you need to change. And some of the stuff that happened, the Celtic bishops got offended because Augustine refused to stand and greet them when they met. Now that's a pretty important thing to get upset about, I'm supposing. But luckily, the king of Northumbria, a place up in Ireland area, they had a big council, and he decided, the Celtic Christianity needs to move over and adopt the customs of the Roman Christianity. Again, we see some emperor influence creeping back into the church business. And after that edict came out, they sent two new leaders up that was a little bit more lenient. Let's bring them along slowly instead of forcing this thing to happen all at once. And it's interesting that England and Ireland turned around and come back and evangelized into Europe after Europe had evangelized them, because things had gotten so bad in Europe with the church, with the leadership, with the morality of the bishops, of things that's going on that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. So we had the changing of the guard that come in, and the first one that moved in was called this Merovingian dynasty. And this started off, well, men they remembered what was going on with the Romans and the Roman peace and they wanted this to happen again, but they were looking for it, and they were hoping this new Roman Empire would appear. And these Franks, who become this that dynasty, they appeared like they're going to be able to restore that imperial authority. And the prime guy, the name of Clovis, he was the one that made them a dominant power up there in that Germanic area amongst the German tribes. And he also became the first ruler of the Franks to accept this Christian or Catholic Christian baptism. And along with him come about 3,000 of his warriors at the same time, which brings to mind Acts. Peter made the speech, 3,000 people joined. Except it's a little bit different here. His conversion was a matter of royal policy, not really a matter of changed belief. And besides that, his conversion was probably more the result of his persuasion from his Catholic wife than it was from acceptance of the gospel. See, during this time frame, there's many Catholic queens and many Catholic princesses that had an influence upon their husband and brought him into it. But this conversion of Clovis laid the foundation for between the Franks and between the church. But he still didn't allow the church to get any influence or anything going on to his royal policies. So Gregory's attempts to revive Christianity or to revive church in the West were thwarted because these rulers wouldn't really let him rule the church as much as they wanted to rule the empire, which included the church. And they also, these new rulers, assumed that, well, the church and its offices are part of our empire, so they're ours to do with as we want. And there's these church offices that are a pretty good way to make a living and a pretty good way to make money. We'll sell them with the highest bidder. But after Clovis's death, the dynasty weakened with weaker and weaker emperors, which seems to happen, and this constant civil war going on to get it back, weaken them down. Which brings in another German tribe called the Carolingians. Charles Martel, while he wasn't the first ruler of it, he was the one that established or started it up. He supported a mission into Germany so he would be able to expand his rule into Bavaria. See again the motive? We don't want these missionaries to come in here to extend the realm of Christ. We want them to come in to extend the realm of me. And, of course, the church was grateful for his support, and especially when another thing that Charles Martel did, and Martel means the hammer, he was quite a warrior. He stopped the Muslim invasion that was coming in from the east. He stopped it. And the church had allowed him to use their land and their profits from that land to finance the army to beat back the Muslims. But the kicker was when he did that and won, he said, well, I'm just going to keep this land. Thank you much, Bishop. And the bishop says, well, the Lombards have come in here into southern Italy. That's that yellow area down in the boot of Italy. And we would like you to run them out. And he says, well, them Lombards was a great help to me in whipping the Muslims. So, nope, I'm not going to do that either. I made a note to myself, what strange bedfellows politics make. So this started off that Martel and the bishop didn't get along too well. But Martel had two sons. Both of them were raised in a monastery, which kind of brought that church influence back into the royalty to it. And they helped another bishop by the name of Boniface start reform of the Frankish church, the clergy, and the organization. And one of the sons went back into the monastery, decided that life was better than government service, was left Pepin the sole emperor of the Carolingian Empire. And he had negotiations with Zachary, who was the bishop at that time, resulting in him getting anointed as king. All this to bring us to Charlemagne. He was the son of the Pepin, but before this, Pepin had appealed to the Pope that whoever the emperor is should be the one that has the power to be emperor. And the Pope says, that's a good idea, so he crowned him as the emperor, and that kind of settled down the feuds going on between all the other people. But Charlemagne then, he said he was Pepin's son. He moved in and was crowned, but he didn't like the idea of owning his crown to the Pope, and he always kept that papacy subordinate to his rule because he grafted together the Christian concept of a universal church with a traditional Roman view of an empire, that being the emperor is a God-ordained ruler, not just a regular person. Kind of coming back to this early Caesar's idea, isn't it? So then we have this medieval theory, and it's a theory of church and state. And that theory was it's a harmonious interplay to secure the good of mankind, in which the church would be a Christian society organized to secure spiritual blessings, where the state was that same society united to safeguard the justice and human welfare. And we're just going to work together hand in hand. While in fact that really didn't happen because the Pope and the Emperor were constant contestants to see who was going to be the power, and there wasn't any real harmony involved at all. As I said, there were some problems that they had all the way through of who's in charge. The Pope needed protection from the invaders, and Charlemagne needed divine sanction to unite the people, but he still didn't like being subordinate or subservient to the bishop or the church. So they were always in contention. And some of the problems that they had was this iconoclast controversy talked about earlier. Do we have statues? Do we have pictures? Or don't we have statues? Don't we have pictures? And of course, there was the continuing political antagonism between the Eastern and the Western emperors, between the Eastern and the Western bishops. And this led to, we're going to attack the beliefs and practices of one or the other one, both of them claiming to be the real one and the other one to become a fake one. And again, the date of Easter was a very important arguing point. And the tonsure controversy. The what? I had to look that one up too. This was a big deal. Really big, even more than standing up when you come in for introductions. It had to do with the clergyman's hairstyle. The argument was, you can see the Roman custom. We shaved the back of the head. You can see the Celtic custom. We shaved the middle of the head. Which one was right? Important controversy. And another one, clergic celibacy. See, in the East, you could marry. In the West, nope. And there was another theological controversy come up. Did the Holy Spirit descend from the Father through the Son, or did the Holy Spirit descend from the Father and the Son? See, these kind of things took center stage, I think, in some of the arguments. And one of the big things probably was the language barrier, where it was a Greek-speaking East and a Latin-speaking West. And one of the quotes in there was, East and West could not understand each other because they could not understand each other. And the problems still persisted along with those East-West differences. New questions of belief come up. One of them was the adoptionist heresy, that Christ was only the adopted Son of God. Another one was that question again about the perpetual virginity of Mary, bringing on later the emphasis on the Virgin Mary and her place in the church and her place in the worship. And significant questions come up about the predestination, clear back to Augustine's theory. What is that? Who's chosen? Who's not? And again, that concept of transubstantiation. What happens to the bread or the wafers and the wine when it's properly blessed? And with all these things coming around, they decided we need to start reforming the clergy, and priests should live above reproach. And some of the violations that were in existence at that time was rejection of celibacy, overeating, drunkenness, relationships with women, hunting, carrying firearms, and frequenting taverns. These were problems. And standardization and centralization of the rules of the monastery. See, there were several guys had several lists of rules, and we wanted to, with the Roman idea of everything's got to be the same, we got to bring them together. In fact, there were some teams put together, one nobleman and one clergyman, one guy for the emperor, one guy for the bishop, and they would go roam around the country to make sure things were happening as they should be happening. The rules were enforced. And in fact, Louis the Pious, the guy that followed Charlemagne, he was a weaker guy, but he appointed Benedict to oversee all the monasteries to make sure that was going on. And because Louis the Pious was a little bit of a weaker pope, emperor, after Charlemagne's death, the Bishop of Rome was able to reassert his independence. And this kind of then put on to brakes the idea of a state church that didn't happen on England into later years where the king did become the head of the church. Well, despair and darkness, political chaos threatened the independence of the bishops, and then come up this thing called a proprietary system of laymen controlling what went on into the church. What that was about is the guys provided the land, they erected the buildings, and their thinking was, since we provided the land, since we erected the buildings, we get to choose who the local priest is going to be. And this system then further increased that abuse of simony, and again, that's a sale of church posts, regardless of qualifications. Kind of like the golden rule, he who has the most gold gets to make the rules. And also church property was still being ransacked by foreign invaders and also absconded or taken over by the nobility of that time. Because the noblemen treated the church, they treated the monasteries as their private property to do with as they wish. And this caused the clergy then to become a little indifferent to duty, and their ignorance and immorality increased because they really weren't prepared for the job that they had bought. Well, the Saxon dynasty rose up, and Otto come in and gave these abbots and bishops rights of princes, and they turned things around and brought the church then out of the politics. I'll do a quick summary. There's a lot of that stuff that I skipped over. But in the middle of this period with mass conversions, tribal warfare, secular influence in church business, also church infighting, empire building, quests for church dominance, foreign invasions, empire splitting, civil wars amongst competing emperors, and selection of church officials going to the highest bidder, regardless of qualifications, and the clergy becoming more interested in secular affairs than they are in the spiritual well-being of the flock. All of these things, peace, harmony, and unity, were only wished-for concepts. How in the world would Christ be ever able to build his church in this kind of an environment? It seems like the gates of hell were prevailing. But God is going to, as we're going to see in future lessons, he's going to raise up faithful servants that's going to combat these problems, these difficulties, and set his church back on the right track. Thank you for your attention. And I know this was maybe a little bit back and forth. It was for me anyway. But I'll close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this opportunity. We just hope that our look at history, at what happened in the past, will cause us to not repeat those errors, but cause us to search the Scriptures for what it is you would have us to do as servants of the church, as servants of Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.